So let's get going. So what are we noticing in our work with teams and in our teaching of team coaches and supervision, I should say? So the first bit that, as we were reflecting and thinking about this webinar and the content was that there's something around a real desire for linear approaches or staged approaches and views to make sense of team challenges. So what we're noticing is team coaches, but also the teams really wanting to and talking about, wanting to be taken through some sort of process or a model as part of their work. And, that model really becomes the containment for anxiety that might be in the team or in the system. Rather than kind of the team coach being seen as the person being able to provide containment. So it's a real desire, really pull towards that. And therefore also a bit of a flight into the safety of imposing linear process models and input to make the work feel contained. And what I want to kind of flag up at this point is Simon and I are not making the point, that we're against sort of more linear kind of process models or sort of staged models of taking the team through a particular process. It's more that we kind of, we're proposing to sort of use them light touch, tentatively, and not see them as a whole truth. Yeah, and the point we're making here is that really we're noticing that pull both in team coaches, but also in teams. And also greater focus on the task than the group dynamics and the relationship between the group dynamic and the task. And when we talk about task, what we mean is the sort of team's performance or the action that they have to undertake or their deliverables. So a real focus of the work wanting to be on that rather than the sort of relationship dynamic. And also an anxiety about not feeling equipped to deal with difficult interpersonal dynamics when they arise. And it's very interesting because we notice this both in the teams and the team coach. So both seek reassurance that nothing too difficult can happen that they then can't deal with. And one of the things is it's a bit of I guess a sign of that is that, we've seen team coaches and teams really fill their time together with models on content and input and attention to task, rather than kind of leaving space for things to happen spontaneously and for things to emerge. So it's a really interesting phenomenon. And, what we're sharing here on this slide, I want to really emphasize, we see this both in what team coaches bring, when they talk about case and supervision, but also, what the team asks team coaches to do. So it's a very interesting phenomenon in our view. So let me say a little bit more about sort of linear views of team. So the definition of linear that I'm offering you here is actually a definition not related to team coaching, but from the Oxford Dictionary. But I think it offers some light of how we might see teams if we take a more linear view. So the definition is really arranged in or extending along a straight or nearly straight line, consistent of predominantly formed using lines or outlines, involving only one dimension and progressing from one state to another in a single series of steps, sequential. So there's certain things that really kind of strike me about this definition of linear, and I'm going to apply it at this point to teams and work with teams. So the first one is really the idea that there are clear lines or clear outlines. Somehow there be tight borders around the team or the work and the task. And as many of us know, as we work with teams, that isn't the case. So a lot of people in teams are part of more than one team, or work and tasks get done across different sections of organizations and across different teams. And often the border around the team is much more semi-permeable than we think. Yeah, so this idea of linearity really takes us a bit down a path of illusion. The second bit really that stands out for me in this definition is that we're only paying attention to one dimension, Yeah, and often that can be the task of the team or the process, how they go about their work, or the dynamics. But actually what's so fascinating and helpful to think about is actually the interplay between those. What happens, in the interplay between the team actually undertaking their task. And finally, really, this idea that somehow we can progress in our work with teams step by step. Yeah, that there's somehow a sort of sequential order in which we can work with the team, which we would argue it doesn't really allow for the messiness in which a lot of teams and a lot of organizations exist these days in a very kind of, VUCA world. Yeah. So that's one perspective of if we were to think about teams in a much more linear way. We now want to offer you a much more sort of systemic and relational perspective. And this for me, this is a lot, kind of influenced certainly for me personally as a team coach by my own systemic practice, my own systemic training as a systemic psychotherapist from many years ago. And I think Simon would probably say something similar about his kind of Gestalt background that he brings to his practice. So the first thing to say is really that individuals do not exist in isolation, which is really important key point. They are embedded in a web of relationships and have a system around them. So if we view individuals and teams in that way, it already makes us open up much more difficult possibilities and opportunities. Yeah? And therefore the work really in a systemic relational view is really the emphasis on exploring and creating heightened awareness of patterns of interaction between people, rather than focusing on the individuals that being the problem or that they need to be fixed. And I've had a particular strong experience with this quite recently when I was working with a team where, and interestingly, the person who was being identified as a problem who needed fixing was a team leader. And that sort of narrative became...
Gosh, I don't have it in Excel.
Sorry, I think we've got someone who needs to go on mute. That sense of kind of having that strong narrative really narrowed the work down. And actually what became so important was to kind of help people to see plurality of alternatives. So I'll say a little bit more about that later. So it's really about moving away from individuals as problems, but looking at patterns of interaction. Another key premise is really that we need to start focusing on the different levels within the system. Every team is embedded in an organizational context, and an organization is embedded in a socioeconomic, cultural, and political context. And all of these will have a huge impact on what's happening within the team. Yeah. So in our work, we constantly going to have to hold these different levels in mind and jump between them as feels appropriate and helpful. And sometimes I certainly in my work find that if it feels a bit stuck thinking about the team level, I'll bring the organizational context in, or I'll bring the wider socioeconomic, cultural and political context in. And often that can help unstick things. And also viewing all behaviors as communication, which is an idea that's offered to us by Václavic. What does it mean if someone always comes back always comes late to a meeting, or doesn't respond to his email, or doesn't undertake his part of the task for the team? So how can we make sense of that? How can we be curious about these things rather than dismiss them? And just a few more kind of thoughts around that before we move on to, so what does that mean to the team coach? So we talked quite a bit about sort of linear cause and effect thinking earlier on. And, I was challenging you to sort of think about, look, let's just think more in a systemic relational way. And what's important as part of that is really starting to look at interconnectedness and circularity. So if two people in the team, A and B, having difficulties, it's a very easy invitation to focus on the cause and effect between the two of them and what happens between them. But what about the other people? How do they react when these two people start getting in an argument? What's the person over there doing? What's the person over there doing? You know, those connections are really, really important. And to keep challenging ourselves to open up, thinking about circularity, is kind of really important to see more than two aspects of a system connected. And of course, all of that applies not just to human relationship, but also to how humans interact with the task at hand and how they organize themselves in terms of their work process. So we're not just keeping that it's circular between people, but also circular between the different aspects of what's happening in a team. Next point is really that everything is really co-created. We are making meaning all the time in conversation, yeah? So meaning does not exist in a predetermined concrete way. And as a team coach, we are part of that. We are co-creating that. We are making meaning with the team all the time. And therefore, what becomes really important is to view information as difference, yeah? So what that means is as teams and individuals and teams start making new connection, hear new information, as they talk to each other, change is happening. I had a wonderful example of that the other day with a team where the team is split across two sites of where they work. And actually, when I got them together, one of the things they started talking about was their realities of what their work looked like, you know, their interactions looked like on the different sites. And it was so enlightening for them, you know, to kind of really hear that, oh, this is your reality. That's quite similar to the challenge that we face. And they've discovered that they had so many fantasies about what was happening on the two different sides. And for me, it was such a lovely example of viewing information as difference, because that's what made the difference. Change was happening in that moment. It was emerging as we were creating the space for this. And the final 2 points is really, you know, the important thing is to hold a state of curiosity in our minds as team coaching. So holding this as a stance really helps us always see different alternatives. Yeah, and encouraging team members to do that, seeing different realities, seeing different truths. I often use that language with teams because it's really helpful, because we can get so stuck in a particular narrative. And what that kind of feeds into is the last point, is that to see ourselves as coach absolutely part of the system around the team. Yeah, I'm always surprised how often I hear people think that as a team coach, there's some neutral entity that can act upon the team in some manner. But actually, like I said before, we're co-creating all the time. We bring our own experiences, our own stories to the work. And that will influence how we see the team and how we interact with the team. So I'm going to stop here, just kind of, you know, this was a bit of a kind of some high level points about how we see systemic relational team coaching. And I'm going to hand over to Simon now, who's going to talk a bit more about, well, so what are the implications for the team coach here?
Thanks, Dorothy. Just before I share some perspectives on some implications for our practice, I have a COVID moment I need to share with you, and then I can let it go. I'm quarantining, having returned from France at the weekend. So at any point, the doorbell may go or my phone may go as I'm being checked up for my compliance with regulations. If that were to happen while I'm speaking, I'll just have to crave your indulgence, because I don't want to be carted off by the authorities mid-flow, but hopefully that won't happen. So picking up on what Dorothy's set out so clearly around some of the implications of a relational orientation, I wanted to talk a little bit about what might that mean for a relationally oriented coach. And as Dorothy said, you know, the dynamics that we pay attention to from a relational perspective, the dynamics of the human system, they may not always be visible or easily seen at the conscious level of a team. They may not be seen by the team itself, and that's more typical, because I think as team coaches, we're trained to look for patterns below the surface of what's conscious. But certainly many of the organizations that I work in, they're not inclined to pay as much attention to human system dynamics and interactions. But although those dynamics may be out of our conscious awareness or out of our clients' conscious awareness, that doesn't mean to say that they don't make themselves felt. They might be subtle, but they exert a powerful influence on how a team functions, and particularly in relation to its tasks and whatever situation it currently faces. So one of our fundamental propositions is that being able to inquire more into the relationship dynamics between team members can actually generate insight into what's going on under the surface. And particularly where there are obstacles or challenges or impediments to the team fulfilling its operational tasks and responsibilities. A relational orientation that has a depth element to it, looks under the surface, can actually help to remove some of those blockers, some of those obstacles in the relational domain that might be getting in the way of task. Can I have the next slide, please, Dorothee? And simply put, many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with this idea, which has evolved from more psychoanalytic group relations perspectives on teams and groups. Teams, one way to think about teams is there is a dimension related to task, the task group, getting whatever the job that needs to be done. But then we have the relationship dynamics operating under the surface of what's overt, observable, and conscious, directly observable. And from a human relations perspective and a group relations perspective, task performance is inextricably bound up with the relationship dynamics. So when I talk about relationship dynamics, we're in the territory, the more subtle territory of the perceptions that team members have of one another, the private thoughts and feelings that they might not feel able to share at a public level, but which nonetheless determine their behavior, their relationships to one another, belonging, membership, inclusion, exclusion, the role of anxiety, particularly when teams are facing significant operational challenges in very challenging environments, such as the pandemic. Heightened anxiety, as you all know, affects our ability to maintain perspective, to do our best thinking, to actually strategize individually and collectively for our responses. So inviting teams to be willing to acknowledge the relationship between task and relationship dynamics is the first step in establishing some legitimacy as a team coach. So one of our practices from a relational team coaching perspective is to offer some psychological education to clients about these sorts of dimensions that Dorothee and I are talking about, which starts to open up, particularly to those teams for whom this way of thinking is quite new. It opens up a bigger perspective on their experience of being and working with one another. Add the next slide. Thanks, Dorothee. So you will all, I'm sure, have heard of the phrase use of self as instrument. This applies equally to individual one-on-one coaching as it does to team coaching. And I was saying to Dorothee earlier, we could run a webinar on every one of our slides because there's so much here. But this is really just to give you a flavor of what we mean by use of self as instrument. And I draw heavily on the work of Michael Clemens, who's a Gestalt therapist here, and have modified this for application to coaching. What does it actually mean for us as a relationally oriented practitioner to make use of ourselves as an instrument for influencing, for facilitating, for coaching in a team environment? One of our propositions from a relational perspective, which is why I'm so fond of relational perspectives, because they're very democratizing. They tend to smooth out some of the implicit hierarchical dynamics that you get in a kind of an expert-oriented approach to consulting and coaching, is that the person that we are is the practitioner that we are. We can't split off our own inner life, our feelings and our responses to our clients in the way some models would have us believe we can. So in order to make use of ourselves as instrument, the first thing we need to be able to do is to embody. And by that we mean give consideration to our felt experience moment by moment as a source of information about the team dynamics, about the uses that the team is putting the consulting and coaching intervention to, about the uses that they are putting the relationship with the team coach to. Whatever we experience is potentially relevant and informational about what's happening in the team. We need to be able to attune to the team. So first of all, we get present to our own experience, and then we open our perspective to include tuning in to the dynamics of the team that we're actually coaching and noticing how we're being impacted by what's happening. As we attune, we might find that certain patterns, certain sensations, certain observations stand out more in our inner awareness. In Gestalt, we call that, they become figural. They tend to fill out and draw our attention to them more than others. And we use that process as a way of prioritizing, as a way of paying attention to what's grabbing my attention here more than other things. And then once we've focused in on that which has grabbed our attention, then we might notice that perspectives, thoughts, tentative working hypotheses, they come to mind. And then we can choose how we might offer that back to the client system as information, as an insight. So part of working with a relational orientation as a team coach requires us, as Dorothee was saying, to collaborate and to work to establish a working alliance with the team, whereby the team and the team coach are both collaborating in reflecting and inquiring into the team dynamic and its relationship to whatever the team's task is. Those of you who already work as team coaches will know that there can be huge discrepancies in what publicly people say they believe the team task is and what privately they might actually understand or feel able to commit to. And so we're working all the time, as the group relations people would say, between the public team and the private team, and trying to bring more of the private team into conscious awareness. Can I have the next slide, Dorothee, please? And so from a relational perspective, the orientation of the relational team coach is dialogic. And that doesn't mean just entering into dialogue, although that's part of it, but a dialogic orientation involves creating conditions and psychological safety for a team to be able to become more curious about what's going on under the surface. That in itself is a very rich and potentially challenging area to actually co-create with our clients the psychological safety where the coach has legitimacy and permission to observe and describe what he or she is seeing, even where that might be exposing or challenging in some way. But one way to mitigate some of the risk is not to presume that the coach is the expert and knows more than the client system itself. And that's why we see our interventions, whatever they are, as offers, gestures, or hints at something, hints at a possibility. And from a relational perspective, we don't presume to know in advance what might be useful. We simply offer a perspective and we see what happens next. And what happens next is full of information about how the team is making use of the intervention or not, and whether or not that intervention has hit upon something that is meaningful and valuable for the team. So our interventions are always informed experiments. The psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott has just floated into my mind. I've just had an association with Winnicott, who used to say, interpretation is the vehicle by which I reveal to my clients the limitations of my understanding, not the superiority or the expertise of my understanding. But when I make an intervention and it's not right for the client system, that difference, that wrongness in inverted commas, actually provides the catalyst for further exploration. So one of the great liberating implications of this is we don't have to put ourselves under pressure to be the expert who has to know what the perfect intervention might be to get the desired result. We simply accept that we can't know that. All we're doing is hinting at possibilities and then watching to see what hints the client system is able to pick up. So we pay a lot of attention to how the team is responding to our interventions and the meaning they're making from them or not. Because we believe that meaning, learning, insight, new possibilities, they emerge in the in-between, from the in-between of the dynamic relationship between team members themselves and the team coach and the team members. And we're seeking, as Dorothee was saying, to find a balance between predetermined ideas of what should be happening here and emerging perspectives and possibilities based on what is actually happening here. I know you say you all understand what the commission of the team is, but what's actually happening in your practice? And does your practice support what you purport to say you know about the team commission? Because often, again, there's a gulf between the espoused theory, what the team thinks it's about, and theory in use, what the team actually does in practice. And from a relational perspective, we're working constantly with attention to both sides of that equation. Next slide, please. So just finally, here are some, and this is not an exhaustive list, but here are some of the things to be thinking about to foster and cultivate a stance where we can work more relationally as coaches. Actually, I think we went back a slide, Dorothee.
Oops. Oh. There we are.
That's it, yeah. So marginality is very important. In other words, not getting lost and over-identified with the team dynamic. So we are collaborative co-researchers and we maintain a perspective so that we can hopefully see things that those individuals who are socialized into the system of the team itself might not be able to see for themselves. Collaboration and co-responsibility are very key as ideas here. It's not the team coach's responsibility to get the team from A to B, but to provide conditions, perspectives, novelty. Right? One of the Gestalt principles for change is that change happens when we experience something that we haven't experienced before. The team coach, from a relational perspective, acts as a source of novelty, novel perspectives, novel energy. Ed Nevis, the famous Gestalt OD consultant, used to say the job of the coach and the consultant is to introduce energy, perspective that is undeveloped in the team environment, to create that kind of grist, that catalytic possibility of new insights to emerge. We balance both linear, predetermined stage model approaches with giving room to notice what's actually emerging here that we hadn't factored into our planning. The presence and the personhood of the coach are very important. The ability to contain anxiety through how we respond to what's happening by not overly reacting, by simply being able to model staying thoughtful and reflective, even when things are becoming tricky. Use of self as instrument, I've spoken about. Modeling what's less developed in the team, I've spoken about. And then balancing supportive interventions with more challenging and confronting interventions. And I'm sure many of you will know that support and challenge are woven together, that you can't have one without the other. Too much of one creates problems on either side of the equation. And we need to cultivate our own resilience and our own capacity to sit in the fire of what might be emerging that is challenging for the team and model a way of staying present to it and curious rather than reacting, getting caught up in conflicts, which requires us to be paying a lot of attention to our own human limitations, our own human vulnerabilities, using supervision so that we can fine-tune our instrument and stay present and maintain perspective when things are getting difficult for the team.